My name is Thais Gibson. I am a coach and counselor and founder of the Personal Development School, and I create daily videos on YouTube here all about the subconscious mind, integrated attachment theory, and how to thrive in relationships in the shortest period of time possible. If you're enjoying these videos and want to like, share, and subscribe, it of course helps the algorithm so much. And if you hit the notification bell, you won't miss any of our daily videos. So, the parenthood paradox and unraveling the trauma behind the fear of having children. This is a topic we are going to cover today. And by the end of this video, I'm going to cover 5 major components that will completely change the way that you might be operating in regards to your relationship and decisions about having children or not having children. Now, I want to just start off by saying, there is no right or wrong answer to this question. There's no one size fits all. There's no everybody should have children, everybody shouldn't have children. Absolutely, there is no such thing. But what is really important, and that we can always really whittle this topic of conversation down to, is what each individual's personal relationship is to the choice about having kids or not having kids, and whether or not this choice is being made from a place of fear or a place of truth. Now, I've seen a lot of individuals thrive, decide they don't want to have children because they care about their freedom, they want to move around, that's just not something they're too interested in, and they move through life, they're really happy, really successful, and they're really complete in their choice to not have children. And then I've also seen quite a number of clients who, through their 30s and into their early 40s, were actually operating in their relationship to this choice from a place of fear instead of truth. And they didn't realize these 5 underlying and very common fears that can dictate whether or not they choose to have children. And by not moving through these fears, as they did a little bit later in life, they actually came to regret this decision or choice. So, we're going to cover these 5 major components that can cause somebody to have a fear of having children. And the way I always sort of have this discussion with individuals in the personal development school or within my own practice historically is that I would get them to really clear out the fears at a subconscious level, really question, challenge, heal, move through these fears, so that then when they are not coming from this fear-oriented place, it's so much easier to distinguish what your truth is, right? If you've wiped out these fears, then you'll know, is my choice to have children or not have children based on my truth or not? And it's really difficult to not get clear from that point from going forward. So the first major fear that I see often dictating whether or not somebody chooses to have children, and this can be something that is really solvable, is if they had an enmeshed childhood. A lot of individuals that were eldest children in relationships and had a lot of siblings that they had to take care of. And so they were sort of playing this parental role at a young age. Or if there was a lot of parentification in a relationship where perhaps one of the children in the family dynamic sort of played the parent role of consoling their own parents, yet they were a child at the time. So maybe you grew up, for example, in a family where there was a lot of drama and chaos, and maybe you were constantly consoling one of your parents or both of your parents, perhaps for that matter. And that would be a form of parentification and enmeshment, where you feel this emotional responsibility or obligation towards your own parents as a young child. They can actually imprint the subconscious mind with this feeling or fear of, oh my goodness, being a parent to these people or to my many younger siblings, it's too much for me. It doesn't feel good. I'm not enjoying this experience. And because the subconscious mind is like an association making machine in so many ways, if you have a lot of early imprinted or programmed associations about what it means to be in this kind of parentified role or authoritative role, it can actually cause you to have negative stored programming about this and come to fear that dynamic being repeated in the future. So just to really clarify that, if you had to grow up too fast and take on too much responsibility in an authoritative or parentified way as a young child, it may cause you to wire in these programs or emotional associations saying, ooh, this parental role for me doesn't feel good. Hence, when you then grow up to become an adult, you may also just automatically project that that's not something you want to repeat again, not realizing that what it means to be parentified as a child doesn't necessarily accurately resemble what it would mean to be a parent as an adult of a child. Okay. And so, if you had to parent your many younger siblings, let's say, for example, you were, 8 years old and you had 4 or 5 younger siblings and you were babysitting and taking care of them and getting them ready and cooking them food and all kinds of stuff at a very young age, which is, actually quite common for a lot of people, then you'll feel like, whoa, playing this role doesn't feel good because you're 8. It's not supposed to feel good. Or if you're parentified at that age, it's not supposed to feel good. If you're consoling your parents or taking care of them as a young child, it's not supposed to feel good. But that doesn't necessarily accurately represent how you would feel as an adult that's taking care of a child and it being your own child and a different experience. So that's reason number one that we can move from this sort of fear rather than truth. And of course, what you would want to do is learn to move beyond enmeshment, question these ideas you have and learn what healthy boundaries you would need and support systems you would need to not feel this over extreme responsibility as a parent taking care of a child in your adult life. And again, this isn't so that you can then just like blindly become a parent. This is an important thing for you to consider working on and working through, so that you can decide, am I moving from fear or moving from truth, right? If you work through enmeshment, learn healthy boundaries, learn to ask for support and rely on other people, and you heal that sort of challenge from a young age, you may still say, and I still don't want kids, and that's perfectly fine. But the goal is to move through these imprints and pain points so then you can really clearly see and decide for yourself. Number two, this is a really interesting one. Number two, you may find that you are in sympathetic nervous system mode too often. So, sympathetic nervous system mode means fight or flight. If you are constantly fight or flighting your way through life, and some other variations of this could be fawn mode, like people pleasing mode, FAWN, or freeze mode, right? If you're constantly in this like walking on eggshells, fight, flight, freeze, people please, or fawn, you know, this system is definitely not conducive to rest, digest, and reproduce mode, which is actually called parasympathetic nervous system mode. When we are in sympathetic, we are not as interested in sex, reproduction, having offspring, having a family. We're in survival mode essentially. Now it is very common if you come from a background of childhood trauma to actually be in a position where you are going through life in this fight or flight mode, because if you grew up having to constantly walk on eggshells, if you grew up constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop, or having some form of attachment trauma in your upbringing, then this is your operating state. Your nervous system gets used to and comfortable with functioning in this fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode. And when you're in that mode, it does not feel safe enough. You do not feel grounded enough, rooted enough, safe enough, regulated enough to have an interest in having children. Now, this is a particularly important one that's important for you to move through, because sympathetic nervous system mode doesn't just affect your relationship to the idea or concept of having children. It affects everything else in your life. It can affect your immune system function, how much cortisol or stress hormones you have. It can affect your thyroid function, your gut health over time. I mean, there's a lot of downsides to constantly being in this fight or flight mode. And of course, it can cause us to make a lot of decisions from fight or flight. Like if you've ever, had something small happen to you and you had a really big flight response or a really big fight response where you're like over defending yourself, sometimes it's because you're just so used to being in this nervous system mode. And again, there can be a lot of output way beyond this. And so I really recommend, if you are struggling with this, to practice doing nervous system regulation techniques daily, whether that be a morning meditation, mindfulness practices or exercises, breath work, light exercise, stretching, just having habits first thing when you wake up, last thing before you go to bed. It's actually when your body and mind subconsciously are most suggestible, meaning you are conditioning with the least resistance during those time periods, your body to get used to a new way of operating. So if you have a daily habit in the morning or evening like that, then what that's going to allow you to do is get used to being more in parasympathetic nervous system mode, and you'll have a new understanding of what you might be open to or excited about, whether it's children or perhaps it's just many different hobbies or things to try or experiences you want to be a part of in your life when you're moving through and operating from parasympathetic much more often than sympathetic. Number four, there can be this really strong dynamic of fearing being out of control. And if you had a lot of childhood dynamics where you were constantly being controlled or you constantly felt out of control, then essentially what can take place is you can basically operate through life where you are constantly trying to control your own life because it's like number one, a subconscious comfort zone. So let me break this down in like a really clear example. Let's say, for example, that you had two very strict, very controlling parents, or maybe it was even like your family of origin or something, maybe a religious sort of camp that you belong to. Let's just say for whatever reason you grew up in very controlled circumstances, very strict rules. Then what's essentially going to happen is you have this constant feeling of like you can't get your needs met, right? Your needs are being controlled by someone else. And so as an adult, you are likely to essentially um, end up in a position where you either are terrified of being controlled. And so you'll live life kind of by the seat of your pants because you just don't want any feelings of being controlled again. Or as trauma usually has it, it operates in polar opposite extremes. So you may instead end up being really, really controlling over your own life, your own time, your own routines, your own body. And there's this element when it comes to having children that poses this fear at a subconscious level to many individuals of this dynamic of like nothing is in your control. Like once you have a child, you can't control your sleep schedule. You can't control if there's, things that happen all of a sudden. If your child, gets sick or struggles with health issues, or there can be so many things even in the process of being pregnant, right? You can feel out of control of your body. And so if there's a lot of deep subconscious wounds or fears around feeling out of control, then that can actually be something that poses this seeming threat to your subconscious mind because it's like, oh my gosh, these negative emotional stored associations I have from childhood of feeling controlled or out of control, right? Because they're essentially creating the exact same output. Those things are what are being pushed on. And so until you actually reprogram your own subconscious fears of being controlled or feeling out of control, and learn to actually have like a healthy balance where you can be more present in your life and be okay with, it's still healthy to plan things and to organize things and to have an intentional way of living. But if we become too rigid in that and we don't have enough balance of surrender in our lives and ability and capacity to be present and go with the flow, that imbalance can get projected onto the idea of having children, feel like those wounds are threatened, and then we shut down or avoid because we're operating from that fear-based place. Number four, if you are struggling to take care of yourself, then this can also be a really painful dynamic, right? So if you're in a space where you don't feel like you can take care of yourself, if you don't feel like you're in good health, if you don't feel like you have a certain degree of financial security or stability, or if it feels like you are, there's a lot of challenges in our world right now, right? Like let's tell it as it is. There's massive inflation. There's a whole bunch of different issues happening quite globally at this time. And obviously people are being very differently affected based on where they're living and where they grew up, and many different elements can come into play here. But if you don't feel like you can fend for yourself or take care of yourself, again, you're going to be more likely to be back into that survival based mode rather than being in this mode of feeling like, you know what, I can fend for myself. And I even trust myself to take care of and or protect someone else, right? A child. And this can really be affected by our partnership dynamic, because if we're in a position where we don't feel like we have a partner who we trust, that we can rely on, if we have a big core wound around helplessness, meaning that sometimes we feel like we can't be supported or we don't trust that we will be supported, if we don't have a healthy partnership dynamic here, and again, I'm not saying that you should only have children if you have a partner. There's a ton of single parents that absolutely crush it and thrive. And, it's such a challenging dynamic for single parents to be a single parent because there's so much pressure and so much responsibility on single parents. And at the same time, if you don't have this element of trust in your partnership, or if you are, in a potential dynamic of feeling like you might be a single parent, that does actually trigger certain biological fears that we have when it comes to reproduction. And so there can be this dynamic of not taking care of self, not feeling like you can trust that you can rely on other people or have enough support or stability in your life to be able to feel safe and enough in rest and digest and reproduce mode to actually want to move down the path of becoming a parent. And then number five, last but not least, we may have this massive fear of being trapped and a huge, huge need for freedom. Now, you know, the need for freedom can be a really healthy thing. There can be a lot of people who really value their freedom, care about freedom, excel within their dynamics of freedom, and there can also be us just fearing losing any ounce of our freedom to the point where we actually become rigid in our need for freedom. And it's funny because the moment we become rigid in our need for freedom, we actually subconsciously steal our own freedom in the process. If we are inflexible about our need for freedom, if we're unwilling to question or challenge the ability to go with the flow or surrender to compromise with other people sometimes, if we are so in a protective mode around freedom, it actually usually represents childhood trauma around feeling trapped or fearing being trapped. And so again, this goes back to a point we were kind of talking about earlier, where we have to be able to recondition the core wounds and fears of being trapped in order to operate within this dynamic. And sometimes within this dynamic as well, I'll hear people say, the world is such a difficult place. And how could I bring a child into the world the way it is right now? And I hear a lot of that happening in the world. And I hear that and I validate that. Like, I know that the world is going through some really, really chaotic and challenging times right now for countless and endless reasons. And I also want to say, like, there were generations that lived through war and had children, like physical war. There are many generations also before us that went through, arguably similarly traumatic dynamics, sometimes maybe even more dramatic dynamics, and definitely different parts in the world currently or recently or within the past that are going through traumatic dynamics. And you are like, every person is welcome to choose from this place of like, but I still don't like the circumstances of the world right now. And it doesn't make me feel like I, am inspired to bring a child into the world or to do things like that. And again, that really comes down to each individual choice. But, I would ask each person to unpack, I can't bring a child into this world. What does that really mean? Right? Like, what are all of your containers of stories within that framework? Are you afraid that you can't protect a child enough? Are you afraid you won't be a good enough parent? Are you afraid that you are scared to see somebody else in pain and see a child go through being challenged in our world because you might have some enmeshment issues, or you think pain is the worst thing ever and nobody should ever be in pain? And maybe you have these one-sided stories about pain itself because, well, pain is difficult. Pain also is the very thing that allows us to grow and thrive and become resilient and move through things and learn and adapt and pivot and do all these human beautiful things that we're wired to do as human beings. And so while pain is definitely uncomfortable, pain does have upside sometimes. So I have some exciting news, which is that we are doing $1,000 off of our lifetime membership sale to the Personal Development School, which means you get access to literally everything at PDS for your entire rest of your life. Essentially, that entails all of our different courses you have lifetime access to. I do 4 live webinars a week, every single week. You can access them ongoing, and you get access to all of our daily community events. So I'd love to see you on the other side, and you can access it by using the link in the description box below. So, sometimes we have a whole bunch of little dynamics in there where we're afraid, right? We're afraid to see someone in pain. We're afraid that we can't do it, or it's not possible for us. And if we're moving from fear, we want to be able to question those stories. We really want to be able to, develop healthier boundaries, learn to rely on other people, because each of these things that we talked about here today, whether it's enmeshment, That's healed through boundaries, right? If it's sympathetic nervous system, that's healed through nervous system regulation work. If it's feeling trapped, helpless, out of control, afraid of losing your freedom, that's healed through core wound reprogramming. If you think you can't take care of yourself or you can't bring a child into the world, you know, we have to heal those stories and those narratives that we have. And then we're welcome to not bring a child into the world, but at least you'll know you're coming to this conclusion from a place of truth because you've worked through the fears rather than coming to this conclusion just based on those fears dictating how you're feeling and what your future becomes. So, if you ever want to dive in, we've got a lot of courses. We actually have a course on nervous system regulation at the Personal Development School that literally you can learn all the things you need to know about nervous system regulation in 45 minutes because all the tools are there, they're laid out. You can check that out for free for 7 days. We also have core wound reprogramming courses if you want to overcome the fear of being trapped, helpless, powerless, out of control. It's called the Emotional Mastery and Belief Reprogramming course. You can check all of those ones out down below. And it's free for 7 days. So I hope you enjoy. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you in future videos.